Morning, friends. Is this appropriately loud? Okay, great. Well, I'm really honored to be here. Again, my name is Mako Nagasawa. It's been a pleasure to be getting to know Pastor Tracy over the last couple years, and now to meet his spiritual family. So I'm here all the way from Boston but it was a lovely drive. I'm glad it wasn't raining like yesterday. But to reflect a little bit on the story that we just read. How many sermons have you heard on that passage? Just kind of give 1, 0? I'm going to have to bug Pastor Tracy about this. I mean, what an amazing story, right? Heaven and earth colliding, time bending, people getting cut off in conversation by God. I mean, it's just like, wow. But I want to share a story to introduce like how I felt like Jesus bent time and space for me recently. It was the morning of October 13th of last year. My friend Jesse in Albuquerque, New Mexico, had gotten up and he was starting to pray. And in his conversation with the Lord, Jesus said, "Pray for Mako this morning." So Jesse did. And then he texted me to let me know, like somehow God had put me on his heart. And I received his text within the hour after I had walked into my mom's place and discovered that she had passed away. She had been 81 years old. The autopsy later said that it was a heart attack caused by hardened arteries. In the moment, though, it was just a complete shock because she had just gotten back from New Zealand from one of those tours, that people love to go on, on a bus, and saw the Lord of the Rings, sight, the cherry blossoms. She bobsledded down a hill. My sister and I were like, maybe that was a little too much. But that morning I had gone over to visit because she had not returned several of my calls over the last few days, which was not completely unusual, but so it was still a surprise. And I had just had enough time to run downstairs, let the apartment manager know, and call 911, and then Jesse's text came, just as I was sitting there wondering what else should I be doing. And it reminded me that Jesus saw me, that Jesus knew, and he was present with me, because God is good all the time. So the Lord reminded me of his goodness and his presence in many other ways. As my family talked and prayed about this, I felt like Jesus was speaking to me through different passages of Scripture. People in my church reached out and brought food over, and I felt like Jesus was caring for me, caring for us. Different friends offered to help me clean my mom's apartment, which was a huge help. And then when my sister flew in from out of the country, and we spent our time slowly going through mom's belongings and some pictures and talking about memories, and then viewing her body and sharing what we felt like the Lord was doing in each of us, that was a special bond. It felt like a cloud had descended. Of glory, not of pallor, not a gray cloud, but a cloud of light. And when my son and my dad each had difficult responses to my mom's death, the Lord was present with me and gave me words to say. So I tell you this because it's always good to be reminded that the presence of Jesus is with us everywhere we go, and we can access his presence in special ways for ourselves, for our loved ones, for people across the country. Somehow Jesus, by his presence with us, can bend time and space to connect us. And I know that during times of transition. If you are finishing up school, moving on to college, watching family members make these transitions, summertime can often be a time where we think about, like, well, how do we engage with these changes in life? How do we engage with changes that have happened over the last, few years during the COVID pandemic? Or how do we renew our sense of our churches, your church's mission to this community of Springfield? What do we do? How do we re-engage people now that people are coming outside? So I want to take us into the Gospel of Matthew to reflect on that a little bit more. Some background again. The Gospel of Matthew is one of the 4 biographies of Jesus. And Matthew is special. I really like it because it's a manual for discipleship and discipling others, kind of mentoring other people in the faith, in the following of Jesus, written by one of the original 12 disciples, Matthew. So Matthew is at pains to remind us that God is with us. In Matthew 1, Jesus is named Emmanuel, God with us. And then in Matthew 28, at the end of the book, Jesus says, "Lo, I am with you, even to the end of the age." And so I want to dive into this story, though, because it's fun. It is fun. This verse, right, Matthew 17, verse 20, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. This is the verse that promises so much and sometimes seems to deliver so little. Have you ever seen like one of these mountains move? And the assumption is that mountain in this verse equals obstacle. Why do we think that? I mean, maybe it's because of the great song by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, back in the 60s. Baby, there ain't no mountain high enough. Yeah, that's right. Ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, babe. We think mountain equals obstacle in our culture. And we assume that Jesus then means, well, pray about these obstacles in your life and God will remove them by faith, and then we guilt trip ourselves and one another because we seem to still have obstacles. What's up with your faith? But the fundamental question here is that true? Does mountain equal obstacle? In a Jewish context, it does not. It means awesomeness. Mountain to a Jewish audience means the presence of God. And it's even kind of a spiritual formation image of, yeah, it takes a little work, but it's great to get at the top. Just like climbing up to Mount Greylock. Wow. How do we see that? Well, Eden was a mountain. You could tell because there's 4 rivers that come out of Eden. Rivers don't usually diverge in nature. They converge. They found the lowest point. So if they're diverging, it must be because it's moving from a higher point to a lower point. And Ezekiel 28 says Eden was a mountain. Secondly, there was Mount Ararat. Noah's Ark came to rest on the top of Mount Ararat, and then life begins again from a mountain because the Spirit hovered, the waters receded, life began again. It was a new creation from a mountain, right? Just like Eden, Mount Eden. Then third, Mount Sinai, where God met with Israel. Awesome. Then Mount Zion. Oh, I forgot one, where Abraham and Sarah go to the land of Canaan. And what do in Genesis 12 and 13? They build an altar on a mountain because they're meeting with God. So mountain means presence of God. And so Jesus is intending to say something about moving the presence of God from here to there, wherever you go. Notice Jesus said, this mountain. He didn't say any mountain, right? He had come down from that heavenly experience with those disciples, and he says, you can move this mountain, this one. And what had just happened on there? Again, this is what we call the transfiguration of Jesus, where he's somehow lit up with divine glory, and then the cloud of God's presence and light descends on him. Moses and Elijah show up. Peter gets excited. We suddenly learn that he could build tents. Thought he was a fisherman. A long time ago, what's going on? They're retelling a story. They're thinking of a particular story. When God called Israel out of Egypt, he said, come to Mount Sinai, and then they got there, and he descended in fire and smoke and said, Israel, come on up here. And they're like, no. That's scary, but we'll send one guy, the oldest guy. Make him climb the mountain, Moses. So Moses goes up, he passes through the divine fire, and in Exodus 34, you know what happens, right? Like, what happens? His face shines with light. He is partially transfigured. He's partially purified by this experience, by God drawing him through his fire. Elijah had a similar experience in 1 Kings 19. Purified him of his attitude of, I alone am left. Sounds like Eeyore. How many of you are you fans of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings? Because if you are, then we could be friends. We could really, yes, a super fan right here. There are key times that human characters are crowned with light or filled with light because they are faithful through struggle. So Aragorn, in his most kingly moments, right, played by Viggo Mortensen quite well in the movies, he was crowned with light. But in the books, it says this, for a moment it seemed to the eyes of Legolas that a white flame flickered on the brows of Aragorn like a shining crown. And then on the day of his coronation, wisdom sat upon his brow, strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. Frodo was also lit up with light. Then as he had kept watch, Sam had noticed that at times a light seemed to be shining faintly within. But now the light, as they approached Mount Doom and Mordor, the light was even clearer and stronger. Why? Because they were doing the will of Eru Iluvatar, who's the God figure. They were working faithfully to defeat the evil of their day, to fight the Ring and Sauron. And Tolkien was making this amazing literary parallel. He was basically constructing through literature and linguistics what he thought was the earlier pre-Christian story, the myth that existed among like the Anglo-Saxons and the Germanic tribes, because the earliest English literature that we have is Beowulf, and it's already Christian. And so he was wondering, like, well, I mean, these people told stories and had literature before that. What was that like? And what explains why these people came to Christ so quickly? And he was saying, he was hypothesizing that it was a story like Lord of the Rings. Like they believed something like this, where people would be lit up with light by the divine presence as you were faithful, as you struggled for faithfulness, like Moses, like Jesus. And so in the biblical story, we see it. God desires to shine through people. And it happened in stages. For a time, like God dwelled in the temple on Mount Zion. And God's presence was a shining pillar of light. And yet by the time of Jesus, because the people had abandoned God, that place in the temple stood empty. And most Jews thought, well, but when the Messiah comes, somehow God will reclaim his space. He will come, and God in his cloud of glory will live again on Mount Zion. But the issue was, God never wanted just a people with a temple. God wanted a temple people. God was still thinking, come up here on the mountain. Meet with me, face to face. I want to purify you. I want to shine light through you. I want to demonstrate my presence with you. And so, how does Jesus do this in this story? Well, Simon Peter, James, and John seem to think that this was a sign that, hey, Jesus might do this again when we go to Jerusalem, right? Like this, wow, there's this cloud of divine presence that follows Jesus around. Can't wait to go to Jerusalem now because God will retake his space and he will be present with us. Again, yeah, kinda, but not in the same way, because why? God wanted a temple people, not a people with a temple. And so, and just to emphasize this, I think that's why, number one, the cloud of God's glory kind of envelops Peter, James, and John. God even cuts Peter off. Did you notice that? While he was still speaking, it's like, no, that's not. Let me give you this. And one day, as Jesus goes to Jerusalem, dies and rises, then the brightness of God's glory did descend on the disciples at Pentecost, and each of the disciples became a mini Mount Sinai, didn't they? The fire lit was somehow on their heads. They looked like little candles, I guess, running around. But that was Pentecost. The Spirit came down and boom, you are a community now, a temple people. God's presence is like directly with you. And I think, again, this is why Moses and Elijah get roped into this moment to become part of the cloud of glory, because God brings them along as witnesses, and in their day, they had climbed the mountains and desired to see God's face. So it was kind of God's love and grace to them, but also a sign that, look, Jesus' work is going to bring people from the past get to benefit. And so Moses and Elijah represent things from the past, either like the Torah and the prophets, right, like Moses and Elijah, or maybe those who have died and those who still live, because Moses died in the covenant and Elijah mysteriously was taken up to be with God, so he was still alive. So whatever the precise meaning of Moses and Elijah is, they're like roped in, and the disciples see like, wow, this was what God was aiming for the whole time. Later, the Apostle Paul would reflect on this and say, we have such a hope, and so we act with complete frankness, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to keep the people of Israel from gazing at the telos, the ending of the glory that was being set aside. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed, and all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. For it is the Lord who said, light will shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. Wow. Wow. So Jesus actually is playing around with mountains throughout all of Matthew. Did you ever notice that? Like Matthew loves pointing out how Jesus was doing this because Jesus was saying, you know, it's not just Jerusalem anymore or Mount Zion, which is where Jerusalem sat. It's any mountain. And if it's any mountain, then it's anywhere. And so here are some ways we see that. In Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus gives his sermon on the Mount. Oh, was that Mount Zion? No. That was just any old mountain. We don't even know. Somewhere in the Galilee. What's Jesus doing? He's saying, you can have this experience of hearing the commandments of God. Do we have to be at Mount Sinai? No, it could be anywhere. That's crazy. And then later, Jesus multiplies the bread, right? Like there's these fishes and loaves. The loaves, how many were there? Like 5. And then he somehow multiplies them, and then there's 12 basketfuls. 5 and 12 and 7 are, they're numbers associated with King David and the temple, because in the temple, there were 12 loaves of bread. One for every tribe of Israel. And then David has the story where he goes in there and he takes some loaves, right? I think he takes 5. So Jesus is playing around and he's saying, I'm a new David. This is a new temple, right? And I'm even reversing the order. I took 5 and I give back 12 baskets, not just 12 loaves, but 12 baskets full, because something greater than the temple is here. What mountain was that on? I don't know. He did it again with the 7 loaves and makes 7 large baskets full. It's another new temple paradigm. Jesus is saying, the presence of God, it's with me. It's with us. Stick with this mission, because we're taking the presence of God wherever you go. And then we get to this story, Matthew 17, where there's this amazing transfiguration. And then in 4 chapters later, Matthew 21, Jesus stands next to Mount Zion. He's finally made it, and he says, be taken up and cast into the sea. He's talking to the temple and Mount Zion, and the sea represents the sea of the Gentile world in the language of Daniel. And so he's saying you can, again, take the presence of God anywhere, everywhere. And then finally, in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, Jesus is on a mountain. Galilee of the Gentiles. That's what it's called. Right? And he's already modeling for the disciples, your mission will take you everywhere throughout the Gentile world. This mountain is already in the sea of the Gentiles. Let's go get them. Go teach them. So you and I, with Jesus leading us, get to move the presence of God, the awesomeness of the mountain, wherever we go. To Springfield, to Boston, to your school, to your cafeteria, to the coffee shop you like to go. We get to go there. And so, what does it mean to do that? Now, I could tell stories about individual people bringing Jesus' presence with them, but you've probably already heard a lot of stories like that. I want to tell you a team story. My wife Ming and I are part of a team of Christian people who are trying to make home ownership just a little more affordable for other Christians. We got married in part because we had both seen our mentors living in Christian community, sharing a house and launching one another in, because what happens when you share a house? You could pay less, right, on your rent and your mortgage possibly. And you could pay down debt, build up assets, and people can buy a home just a little more easily. In the year 2000, we bought this triple-decker house in Dorchester. Our neighborhood is mostly black, and we were aware and have become more aware over time that, this country has put a lot of obstacles in the way of black and brown people through the banking system and the housing system. And so one of the concerns was, how do we multiply Christian community and also home ownership with our black and brown friends? So we invited people to come live in our house, and we did things like community gardening and engaging with kids, helping to start a neighborhood meeting to talk about safety and cleanliness and things. So there's always been this outward component. There were also inward things that we did, like we gathered to talk about the Sermon on the Mount. We had this experience of being on the mountain with Jesus, receiving his teaching, receiving the commandments of God more deeply into our hearts. Because let me tell you, when you live together, you got to deal with conflict and reconciliation and character. We talked about our finances quite openly, which was unusual in American culture and in most other cultures. We also had to have healthy